Welcome to Am I on Mute? I'm Annelise Campbell.
And I'm Katrina Craigwell. We have a pretty amazing guest to chat with today, Valerie Graves, celebrated creative leader in the industry. And for today's episode, we are really focusing on resilience in general, at large. Something that is needed, I think, from the beginning to the end of life, no matter what's going on. So it's a pretty special conversation to have.
Yeah. When so much is changing so quickly all the time, some people may love the changes and other people may not. Like I think of this interview that Malcolm Gladwell did where he was talking about remote work in particular. And he said, if one end of the spectrum is thriving because of the changes that we're making in workplaces, but another end of the spectrum is suffering because of the changes we're making from remote work, like have we really actually moved the needle that much for everyone? Or are we just making it better for a select group of people versus the entire greater good, which is obviously, a hard problem to solve. But I do think as both employees, leaders, anybody that's kind of in the workforce right now, resilience is really, really necessary. But also being able to like raise your hand and be like, yeah, this isn't really working for me is also really, really important.
Totally. We can't just take broad strokes with change. It takes the time and the work to figure out which version of change works best for a specific context. And, we've talked about it. I think it's on all of our minds, the layoffs. Over 150,000 people in tech have been laid off and counting. I was one of those people. In November, I ended my time at Meta. And in those moments, resilience becomes more important than ever, but it's a muscle, hopefully, that you have been able to cultivate over time. And I think, when hard things happen, you want to lean on all the best practices. You want to have a support network. You want to have family and friends around you. You want to take care of yourself. And you have to take care of what you're telling yourself. And so much of what we get to discuss with Valerie is about the things you tell yourself and the things that you expect of yourself in those moments are more important than ever. So a really important time to be having this conversation.
Yeah, I'm super, super excited about it. I think what you said, it's a muscle. And if you're not flexing it, you're not setting yourself up for success, it's going to be really difficult when you need to call on it to just show up and get you out of a tough situation. Katrina and I heard Valerie speak at a conference and she gave like such amazing pieces of advice. We were like, we have to have her on this episode about resilience, given her tenured experience in this industry. She has quite an impressive resume, so hold on because it's really good. Author and creative guru Valerie Graves, whom Advertising Age magazine named one of the 100 best and brightest in the entire industry, is a nationally recognized creative director of such Fortune 500 accounts as Ford, General Motors, AT&T, Burger King, General Foods, and Pepsi. A former teenage parent from the factory town of Pontiac, Michigan, Graves broke barriers in advertising as one of the first Black copywriters at BBDO, Kenyon and Eckhart, and JWT. An award-winning career as Chief Creative Officer at the UniWorld and Vigilante Leo Burnett agencies, Senior Vice President of Creative Services at iconic Motown Records, and Creative Consultant to President Bill Clinton. In 2007, recognizing Graves' stellar career in public service via the Advertising Council and the Partnership for Drug-Free America, Industry Coalition AdColor granted her the title of Legend. Today, Valerie acts as a creative consultant for the NBA and DE&I consultant for the Ad Club. She resides in New York City. Welcome, Valerie.
Oh, thank you for having me.
To Katrina's point, we've both been super impressed just hearing you speak about your journey and your career. For context for the audience, we had the privilege of hearing you speak at an Ad Club conference in New York City. And we both felt like after hearing what you had to say and just kind of knowing the climate that we're in terms of a lot of shifts in the economy, a lot of shifts in industry, a lot of just major changes that people of all ages and all walks of life are going through, we thought it would be really important to have a conversation about resilience and how to kind of come out of those complex situations that impact work, that impact life, that impact your confidence, like how you show up, all of those things. Valerie, we'd love it if you can tell our audience a little bit about you and your background and how you accomplished such an incredible career over time.
Thank you for that glowing reference to my career. I'm one of those people that was kind of born to end up in the creative department. Even before I knew there was such a thing, I was that little kid who was always making up stuff and putting on shows and writing, and it was very verbal. And as a kid, kind of the more attention that I got for that, the more I became that way. So I was always kind of trying to be creative and do the things that were creative. So, in a way, it was just a natural for me to do something like that. Although, as a little Black kid, of course, I was told, oh, you're so well spoken, you're going to be a lawyer. Um, so, when I was 5 or 8, I thought I was going to be a lawyer. When I got a little older, I just thought about going to a great school. I mean, in my mind, I was headed for Harvard, period, although I guess it was Radcliffe in those days. As the saying goes, man plans and God laughs.
Yeah.
If you read my book, Pressure Makes Diamonds, my mother remarried when I was 13. It was kind of a funny story. She married the guy next door. She had 2 teenagers. He had 2 teenagers. And that chapter is called Mom Drops the Nuclear Family Bomb. Because that's kind of what happened. Everything just kind of blew up and went kind of crazy. In all of the confusion and turmoil,
Yeah.
I kind of lost sight of who I was. And that is the time when I did become pregnant as a teenager. Of course, being a mother at 16, all bets were off
Mhm.
in terms of my heading off to an Ivy League school. Instead of heading off to Harvard, I was headed to a wage earning situation. I went to work in a hospital as a ward clerk. But I never thought that I wasn't going to, for lack of a better term, be somebody,
Yeah.
do something with my life, because so much of my identity was caught up in that was who I was. Even though lots and lots of people, the community, the church, I don't think my family members, but people kind of lost faith in the Valerie Graves that they thought they knew, who was destined for great things. I never could let go of that kind of picture of myself being somebody and going places and doing things. Because I graduated from high school a year early, baby and all.
Overachiever. Like that's that's
Yeah,
incredible.
but it was funny because it really was stuff like, oh, I hated the thought of a study hall. So I would take an extra credit course where you didn't have to sit in a study hall, you were just in class longer. Crazy stuff like that. But it turned out that way, that I actually was able to sit out the second half of my junior year in high school and still graduate a year early. So thank God for extra credit classes. Still, I ended up starting college in the same year that I would have originally if I hadn't kind of skipped that grade early on and graduated a year early. As I said, I never lost sight of it. I did start college and I majored in English, and I was the little engine that could. It was insane what my day was like. I'd kind of rise early in the morning and get my baby dressed and drop him off at the babysitter, and then go to class and take a full load of classes, and then come back and work an 8-hour day. And so I did that until I just kind of couldn't face it anymore, couldn't do it anymore. I had exhausted myself. And I also felt a lot of what is a current way of feeling is like, I could walk out today and tell someone that I graduated from college and no one is going to question me at all. And at a certain point, that's what I did. I don't recommend that people do that. There's a lot of stress involved in doing something like that. But I did know that I was going to do something that had to do with words and language and writing and all of that. And that where I was in college at that point, I wasn't going to learn anything that was going to help me be better at that. So I just made my own decision about that. And the way I got into advertising was that I looked around me and thought, well, what am I going to do with all of these classes that I've taken that have to do with language and English? And there were a couple of choices available to me. One was publishing, the other was advertising. And I chose advertising, first of all, because it sounded more glamorous, and I used to watch Bewitched on television. And I loved Darren Stevens' job, which I later found out didn't exist. He was kind of this person who did everything.
Yeah, it was totally made up, not real for television, like not a real reflection of any job.
Exactly. But there were a lot of people in creative departments after I started working who had that same story. They got into advertising because of Darren Stevens. But at any rate, my decision was informed by the fact that there was big league advertising in Detroit because of the auto industry. So I could go to work at the world headquarters, as it turned out, of Darcy, which had the Cadillac and Pontiac brands and lots of other accounts too. But those were the huge mainstay accounts of the agency. The way that I got my job there was that the president of the agency made a speech at the NAACP Freedom Fund dinner in Detroit, which is a huge annual event, and talked about how they were really looking for more Afro Americans and just couldn't find any. And that was the story for many years. Probably still today, you're hearing that. We don't know where to find qualified people.
Mhm.
He made that speech, and my mother read about it in the paper. And she called me up and said, "Didn't you say that you sent them a resume?" And I said, "Yeah, I did." And she said, "Hmm." And I thought, well, maybe I should call them. So I did call them and said, "Your president said that you were looking for Afro Americans, but I applied there and no one ever called to inquire whether I might be." I'm sure I didn't say African American because we weren't saying that then. But they gave me an interview, and I'm sure they thought that that was where it was going to end. It's like, okay, so we'll give her an interview and she can't say we didn't call her. So I took my samples and I went to Darcy, and a very nice man who was a VP there said, "Listen, obviously you can write, but we don't know whether you can write advertising or not." And so he said, "Why don't you take these ads home and redo them? Do them the way that you would do them. Show us your ideas." And I was back in a flash, of course, with my redone ads. And he said, "You know what? We're going to make you a junior copywriter." It was at a time, it was not an affirmative action program, but it was at a time when the country had an affirmative mindset. Big agencies were kind of on notice from the government that they wanted to see some action. They wanted to see a workforce that looked a little bit more like the country. So there were no quotas that people like to talk about, but they set goals, and people had no qualms about saying to me, "Oh, we get 2 points for you. You're black and a woman."
Oh boy.
Oh, people said things like that in those days. Now they just think them, you know. Um, so I did get hired as a junior copywriter, showed up for my first day at work, was introduced to the creative director, and he said, "Hi, this is Valerie. She's the new junior copywriter, but she doesn't know anything about the business. And so we're going to send her to traffic for a little while and, let her learn the business of advertising, maybe a couple of weeks." And the creative director looked at me very dryly and said, "You're very lucky. It took me 2 years to get out of traffic." So that was my introduction to the new big boss that I was going to have to answer to, or at least who held my fate in his hands.
Hmm.
I went down to traffic. By that time, I was a very experienced ward clerk in a hospital. So traffic in an advertising agency was like child's play to me. So I do the little tasks that they gave me and run up to the creative floor and say, "Is there anything I could work on? Anything I could write? Do you need a writer for anything?" And somebody gave me an opportunity in short order. And I did an ad for Dow Chemical Company for an industrial glue. And my headline was "Stick with the People Who Know." And they said, "You know what? Maybe you need to come upstairs." So I was in traffic for 2 days when they sent me there for 2 weeks. And I am still very proud of that, as you can tell.
A new record,
Yeah,
Yeah.
an all-time record.
that's how I got into the business. In very short order, it just happened that the creative director of the Pontiac account noticed that there were these two young women around. The other was Beverly Okada, who at the time was Beverly Bjorkland. So I went looking for this big blonde who was, I should know, and really she was a little Japanese lady But at any rate, he said, let me have those two girls. I want to put them in the Pontiac group and kind of shake things up and get a woman's perspective on things. By my second week in advertising, I was working on one of the major accounts at the world headquarters of Darcy with 22 men and one woman. That's the story how I got into advertising.
I just feel like from top to bottom, that story is filled with resilience. Like you might be the poster child for resilience. Just even some of the things that you said, so incredible and amazing. And obviously, you made the most of those opportunities, and here you are. So I'd love for you, Valerie, to talk to us about how you define resilience and what resilience means to you.
Well, resilience means being able to take a punch to me and roll with it. One of my favorite figures is Muhammad Ali. Everyone knows that he was a great champion, but if you're old enough to have like really watched his fights or have seen them for some reason, you know that he was a guy who could take a punch. He was hard to hit because he moved around very quickly, and kind of was nimble at staying out of the way, which I also learned how to be. But occasionally somebody would land one on his jaw. He would stop. I was like, oh, it's like that, huh? And then you better really watch out because then he'd want to beat you up. And so resilience to me means being able to take those kinds of shots, step back, and figure out what my next move is going to be.
Yeah, that's such an important point about being able to know when to be nimble, because I think, people might think resilience means you just got to sit there and take all the punches and just get beat down all the time. But I think there's so much truth to being able to adjust and still get up and pivot and move in a different direction, that I think is a skill that everyone really needs to refine and work through. So for you, when did you first realize that resilience was that crucial skill that you needed to get ahead and keep pushing forward?
When you're young, the blows don't always necessarily come from outside. There are times when we can be our own worst enemies. And I certainly had that stage of my career. When I got my first job in advertising, I had this background in writing about music, rock music, hanging with some pretty famous rock musicians. So, advertising, although it was very attractive as a way to make a living and beat the hell out of working in the hospital, might not have seemed as glamorous to me as one might think, because I was having some pretty glamorous times anyway, writing about music. And for a while, it was hard for me to make up my mind. And advertising basically happened during the day and the evening if we were working late, and music happened at night. And the fun part of being involved with music happened late at night. So I was creative, but I was not a great employee early on. I kind of knocked myself down and knocked myself out. They finally kind of like, okay, I guess you're going to make us let you go because of your attendance and that kind of thing. I had to come back from that. I had to get back up and say, what do you really want? What does music and being involved in the way that you are offer you, as opposed to advertising, which kind of offers you a career? And I decided to change cities. I moved to Boston. I changed the focus of my work because I didn't want to become forever known as a car guy. So I moved to an agency, Kenyon and Eckhart, that had a lot of packaged goods kinds of accounts. I worked on banks there. And so I just made a decision to hit the reset button. And when I think about it now, it was like leaping off a tall building and hoping you can fly. Fortunately, it worked out for me. That was a big moment of resilience. I had kind of done myself in and had to figure out how to come back from that.
I love that story because I think we don't hear people tell that story enough, because we don't talk about, how our inner critic can knock us down and set us back. We tend to talk about, oh, I got laid off or somebody gets sick or whatever. We don't talk about kind of those struggles that we're dealing with internally that can set us back. And I love when you talked about the move to Boston and being committed and confident in that decision, because We did some research before this episode about what factors contribute to resilience. And there's this psychologist named Dr. Ken Ginsberg, and he said there's 7 C's to resilience: competence, confidence, connection, character, contribution, coping, and control. And even though some of that, what you just talked about, you inflicted some of that on yourself, but there was confidence in that decision to pivot and move to Boston and diversify your career, which I think is a part of resilience that we need to talk more about so that people can understand, like, it doesn't mean you just have to suck it up and take it. You can pivot, you can be confident, you can be competent, you can contribute in a different way and then set yourself up for success. What advice would you give to people right now who are looking to build more resilience in their careers and how to sharpen that skill? And how did you learn how to sharpen that skill?
I wouldn't so much say that I learned how to sharpen that skill, but I have a pretty metaphysical outlook in general. And when I look back at my life, I owe so much to the fact that I just had a picture of myself. And it was very hard for anyone, including me, to keep that from manifesting for me because I never stopped believing in it. I can remember like being unemployed and statistics would come up about people being unemployed. And I just didn't think of myself as being unemployed. Those expressions like between jobs just before I moved to Boston, they could have invented that for me because the person that I saw myself as was not an unemployed person. She was a person who was between gigs and a person who decided to, I think I'll try the East Coast and change my career from being just a car writer, which could be kind of the kiss of death, to being a well rounded advertising person. I owned those decisions in a certain way. You talk about people who never talk about having done it to themselves. It's always, like something that happened to them. Well, I to a certain extent did that I decided to move to Boston. And there were some very good reasons to have done it besides, I really screwed up and I need to like start over again. As far as what you tell about your own story, it helps when you've already written it all in a book. And the decision to be honest about those things for me was made at the time that I wrote Pressure Makes Diamonds. So people should not be hard on themselves about the fact that it's not necessarily easy to be honest about the things about yourself that don't make you feel proud. I've had a long career now, so people are willing to she screwed up when isn't that cute? It was not cute at the time, but then not a lot of people knew either. So I was in control, one of the C's, of the image of myself that was out there. I'm an advertising person. I know how to put the best face on things, how to still be telling the truth, but just tell it your way.
You talk about having a picture of yourself and the way that you saw yourself. That was clear to you no matter what was going on. Talk a little bit about what contributed to that. Was it people? Was that just in you from day one? Were there people, a support network that helped build that? How does that come to be?
It was absolutely a support network before you even think about having something like that. We in the African American community know that, like smart little kids are singled out. They get attention. People had expectations of me. The people from my church, my teachers, my second grade teacher surprised me with a subscription to Children's Digest when I got skipped out of her class. Mrs. Northcross, I will never forget, nor many of my teachers who just always told me that I was exceptional. I have a very good friend whose mother was my fourth grade teacher. She's still living too. And he said, my mother used to make me so mad because she was always talking about you, But there was that. There was a support system of people who had very high expectations of me at a very young age. So it became part of my identity. I did not have the light skin, long hair, or the wealthy parents, or any of the things that can set you apart in our community. but I was smart. And so I really incorporated that into my image of myself. Well, like, well, what happens with smart people? They tend to succeed in some way. I always saw success and being somebody and all of that as just being part of my being, of who I was going to become. And this person in my picture was always a little bit better than I was. You know, I was always trying to live up to her. Some reviewer of my book described it as faking it till you make it, but I didn't really fake anything. One of my favorite lines from the TV show Living Single is the character Regine who says, I am everything I pretend to be. And that's kind of how I saw myself. People may not know it yet. You may not be able to see it yet. I may not be able to quite dress the part yet, but I know that's me. And I just kind of held on to that no matter what.
I think that's so profound. There's so much to that in terms of holding on to an idea of yourself and not letting that, whatever circumstances come your way, escape you. Like being able to just say, okay, I might be in between gigs. I might be laid off. I may be whatever, but I'm still Valerie, the smart, really intelligent girl who's going to get somewhere. And even now, like I'm just thinking about my own internal self-talk track. I'm like, I need to think about like, what's my internal narrative? Like, what's the thing I'm going to hold on to help me be more resilient and stick through those tough times. I think that's so profound.
In my life, if I have a regret, is that I wasn't dreaming even bigger. You know, it's like, man, I could have been Oprah if I had just.
There's still time.
You can still be Oprah.
It's not over.
You have a lot of time left to still be Oprah or be Valerie.
You know, we'll see.
I also think it's so powerful for all of us. We're parents, we're aunts and uncles, we're family members. We are influencing the next generation, and we have the opportunity to kind of love them with expectations and feed that. And so as I listen to you tell this story, and I think about my son who's 16 months and so many other youngsters who I get to be around, and how do you infuse that in them? Because it's a well of confidence and power that will serve them for the rest of their lives. So a really beautiful thing to kind of pause on.
Another dimension of my identity is I'm Aunt Val. I have many nieces and nephews. I married a fabulous man who's close to a perfect husband as I could ever imagine, and I recently lost him. So it's hard to envision what I'll be doing. But I married him almost 42 years ago. And so I was able to turn my attention away from just myself. Yes, I was always working on my career, but I was looking at my son, my nieces, my nephews, and I'm so incredibly proud of having been an influence in their lives. And they tell me that all the time. I used to bring my nieces and nephews to New York so that they could experience this place and have them picked up at the airport in the limousine so they could know that they were limousine worthy. My husband was a journalist at the big Long Island newspaper, Newsday, on the editorial board for many years, formulating policies so they'd be at our house, you know, and Senator Schumer would call to talk to my husband. I really try to, by example, show them what was possible for their lives. I've tried to be a mentor and encourage people. One of my mentees, somebody that I noticed at Motown, was really smart and a real go getter. Erica Riggs was the 2020 winner of the Nancy Hill Award, and I recruited her into advertising.
Can I ask you I don't know if it's a more personal question, but I'm curious.
You can ask me anything.
You know, when you go through something that is disappointing or upsetting, or is one of those moments where you kind of get knocked around, what does that feel like? How do you process those emotions, and how do you pull yourself out of the other side?
That's a good question. It's a great question because I was only once just betrayed, just kind of stabbed in the back by someone that I personally advocated for to be put into a position where they could stab me in the back. They actually kind of thought that doing that to me was one of the highlights of their career. Somebody told me they put it on their Facebook page that they had like rectified the situation in the creative department. But fortunately for me, I had discovered metaphysics in a more formal way. I had discovered the notion that when someone does something to you, you don't have to do anything to get back at them. It's an old Chinese proverb. It says, sit on the banks of the river and you will see the bodies of your enemies float by. That's one place that I go to. Number one, get rid of like that notion of getting even with anybody because man, if, the universe will take care of them and it'll be way better than anything you could come up with. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is I believe that our beliefs attract the events that transpire in our lives. If you don't believe in it, it probably isn't going to happen to you. So I ask myself, I go to myself, why did you attract that experience? What was it that you were trying to learn? What was it that you got out of that experience? In that situation, I was not fired. My contract was not renewed for a job where I basically kind of felt unfireable. And I said that to someone, even if you're irreplaceable, you can be replaced. They might not get anyone who's as good as you are, but they can replace you. And that happened to me. In that situation, my contract was not renewed for a very stressful, important. I mean, I was chief creative officer of an agency with 6 creative groups, 6 group creative directors working under me and people working under them, and kind of keeping it all afloat. A year after that, I found myself in a job at Vigilante that was more strategically structured than the job that I had, lost because of not having my contract renewed. I was working with a lot of the same people, a lot of the people that I had kind of had in my creative groups before because it's a small universe when you're doing multicultural advertising. And I was just happier, less stressed, and making the same money by just thinking, that you may have had something to do with it. Sometimes your beliefs will take you through just a little bit of discomfort on the way to bringing you exactly what you want. And that's what happened to me. I was very happy in my new job. It was much less stressful, more creative, and also I had much more strategic support. Sometimes looking within oneself for the things that happen to us. Early in my career, it might have been things that I was quite deliberately doing. Later on, it was not at all that way. But still, I was the one who was creating the situation that I found myself in.
Amen to landing in where you need to be at the end of the day.
Exactly. And to knowing that you are always where you're supposed to be. I mean, when I lost that job, I had a non compete year built into my contract. So I also got a year to just kind of rest up from that very stressful job that I had been in while, being paid, just kind of chilling and, having the chance to reflect and decide what was going to be the right next opportunity for me.
Yeah, and again, I think that thread of confidence comes through, like taking the time to pause and reflect and not feeling like I have to jump to whatever is next in front of me, like just being able to be confident in being still and saying, no, whatever comes to me will be best for me based on my ability to self-reflect, my ability to process this, my ability to move through this tough situation with confidence and competence and incredible.
Well, you know what, too? That one of the other C's I think had to do with connections or connectedness.
Mm-hmm.
A non compete year is really designed to take away your value, but it doesn't include not for profit, pro bono types of things that I had always done. And not always. There was a certain point in my career when I thought, this is turning into a very nice career, but I'm not really doing anything to give back. And as soon as you send a message like that out to the universe, here come your opportunities. Here comes the ad council. Here comes the advertising club. Here comes the partnership. They all need your help. They need people who are willing to give their time. And guess what? When you lose your job, they're there for you. You can still do those things because they're not paid. You're not competing with any of your former employer's clients. So I was able to stay visible, but also to be in a low pressure kind of situation where the people are just happy that you will give your time and work with them and do the things that you do for them. Cultivating connections that don't necessarily pay you money, but will pay off in the long run is something that I would recommend because it's the right thing to do, but also because doing the right thing often pays great dividends.
It's a great call out.
Valerie, I think you've given us so much. I think your story is absolutely inspiring and incredible. And I think you've touched on elements of confidence, competence, character, connection, some of the things fundamental to resilience. So, for those of us who may not be going through those tough times right now, for those of us who may be on the other end and we're trying to show up for someone who's going through something difficult, how can we support others and help them build up resilience or just be a port to someone who's working through and developing resilience during tough times?
Well, I think you have to encourage people to see themselves in the best possible light. You know, that woman who is always like right over there for me, my future self, my 6 months, 5 years, 10 years into the future self. I think everybody should have a person like that in their lives. It's rare to get fired for incompetence. That would tend to happen like early in your career, is like because maybe you're not even doing the right thing. But if you're a early mid career professional, the reasons that you were let go from the situation are likely to be not necessarily your fault. It can, in fact, be, restructuring, downsizing. It also can be a personality conflict. I have a friend who's dealing with that now, who shall remain nameless. Basically, the boss just like hates you. For me, the key there is to look at that person that you want to become and say, what would she do? How would she handle this situation? Most of the time, I think in a situation like that, it's like just start looking for your next situation. Whether you like where you are or not, it may not be your choice whether you remain there. Seeing yourself in the best possible light, asking yourself what your best self, that self who's just a little bit better than you think you are right now, what would that person do? How would they handle this situation?
I love that. That's really, really helpful. And I think it reminds everyone to kind of pause, take a moment, reflect, look inward before, we do what humans tend to do, which is catastrophize and assume the worst and all that loathing, pity, like woe is me mentality. I think taking the opportunity to pause and reflect and see how you can be a hand to someone else is really important.
Valerie, there's a big element of that, again, about expectations and raising expectations on yourself and having a support network that is going to be there with you to raise those expectations and see you through and up to those. So it's almost like at every moment, it's okay, if I reach higher, what does that mean? Versus, oh my God, and at least to your point, it's a catastrophe. Very interesting to kind of hear that thread come through a lot of the advice and the stories that you're telling, Valerie.
Losing my husband has been the thing that I hope in my life be the hardest thing to bounce back from, if you can even call it that. It's kind of to survive. Resilience in this case just means, getting up every day, continuing to try and be a vital person. I couldn't do any of that without a support network of friends and family. But really, a lot of my friends in New York are people who became friends as colleagues. They were partners at work, or someone that I had mentored, or someone who worked with me at one of the agencies. So, I have a lot of friends who were made at work. The relationship deepened into people who support me both professionally and personally. And I think that's hugely important. I don't know what I would do without my friends.
Shout out to friends. We all need them. Thank you so much for your time, Valerie. I think you dropped so many gems. I think people listening to this will take a lot from your experience and your wisdom and your empathy and honesty and just transparency about what you went through, which I think is incredible. So now we'll go to our rapid fire question.
What is the one piece of advice you've received that has stuck with you throughout your career?
I think you just have to chalk this one up as a loss and move on. From my old boss at UniWorld, Bill Allen.
Love it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I am so happy to have received this invitation because my personal motto after such a long, long career in this industry and being happy to still be here, I always want to say age is not the enemy, irrelevance is.
Valerie, it's a gift to have you here.
Love it.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Wow. I don't know how you're feeling about after that, but I feel like I can conquer the world. Like I feel like I've learned so much.
That was amazing. And we're also sending a lot of love to Valerie in this next chapter of her life. We are thinking of her and know that she's supported by a wonderful community.
Yeah, she said so much that really resonated with me. I think one of the things that will stick with me is her point about just really knowing yourself and being honest with yourself, especially when you're in tough situations, because sometimes we have the natural proclivity to be like, well, this isn't my fault. I didn't have anything to do with this. Like, this is just happening to me. And sometimes that is not the case. Like sometimes you really have to sit and look at yourself in the mirror and be like, are these the consequences of my own action? And it's not to say you don't need to be less resilient, whether or not you are the cause or somebody else is the cause. But I do think it's really important to take that moment to reflect and be like, did I set myself up a little bit here? And if so, like, how do I work through that? And how do I get past that? Because it might look a little bit differently when it's like, oh yeah, I had nothing to do with this, right? Like as she mentioned, like sometimes you're just going to get fired from your job. That's going to really have nothing to do with you. Like there's nothing you could have done differently, which I thought was really refreshing and honest to hear because I feel like I don't hear a lot of people talk about that.
I just want to spend one more minute on that too, because one of the things I felt building on that kind of radical accountability, it's being honest with yourself and asking the tough questions. And it's also knowing that you can control your own behavior. You can control only what you can control.
Yeah.
And so it made me think as well of a lot of the conversations that I've had with our Coach Kate, that I remember early on, sometimes things would happen and I'd talk to her about them. And it wasn't that she was invalidating the experience in any way or kind of pushing back, but she gave no airtime to the moments in which I might have been going down a path where something was happening to me. There wasn't airtime for it. Not because whatever was going on wasn't going on, but because it didn't serve us to spend time there, because what mattered was what I could control, how I could show up, how I could recover. It's all in the recovery. And so I just think that's such an important muscle, because it's a muscle to build
for sure
for all of us.
Yeah. I was just having this conversation with a friend, had a major career change. She just had a baby and now she is getting ready to go to med school. And she sent me a text literally last night and was like, I think I know what you might be feeling when you talk about like feeling like it's tough running a company. And I'm like, tell me more. What makes you think that? And she was like, you're doing it alone and it's all going to feel difficult. Like there's no point where your expectation is that, oh, this is going to be a walk in the park. Like that's just unrealistic. When she said that, I was like, yeah, like tough feelings are just going to be tough. Like there are going to be some moments in your life where no matter how much you try to paint a different picture, no matter how much you try to convince yourself, it's just going to be a difficult emotion or feeling or situation that you're just going to have to get through, right? And so that's the time you have to lean on resilience. That's not the time to reflect on every single thing that you said or be super self-critical. Like that's not the time. That's the time to just say, this is going to suck. I don't know how long it's going to suck for, but this is when I need to rely on some of the tips and tricks that Valerie mentioned and like really dig deep and know who you are and be resilient in that way. Cause I think sometimes we just, oh, it's going to be hard, but I'll get through it. Like it won't be, I'll have positive feelings about it. It's like, no, you won't. You probably won't. And that's okay.
Can I just say, anytime I've tried to skate through a hard situation and be like, I'm just going to keep going and it's fine, it never worked. The universe is always like, I'm sorry, ma'am, you're going to have to stop and look at it and feel it and you will be okay. So,
yeah, I'm reading this book right now. It's called It's Emotional, How Feelings Shape Our Thinking by Leonard Mlodinow. I'm sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly, but it'll be in our notes. But the whole book is about the purpose that feelings serve. And there's a great section around negative emotion and why we need it and why it's absolutely essential for our survival as a human species to like evolve and process difficult things. One of the things he said that stuck with me was that sadness is the number one emotion that elicits change and reflection. And I was like, that's so correct. Like, it either causes you to be like, oh my gosh, what went wrong? Like, reflect and look back on it. Or it's like, oh my God, I never want to be in this situation again. I don't want to feel this again. Like, let me do things differently. So it's a really interesting book for those of you who are trying to like better understand how emotions might affect you at work, might affect your mood, might affect any of the things in your life. Really, really good book if anyone wants to get a better understanding of emotions.
I love that reframing of the power and potential
Yeah.
of sadness. We'll add it to our reading list. Well, thank you everyone for listening. It's been great to have you here once again for Am I on Mute?
Thanks so much for listening. As always, if you have suggestions, thoughts, episode ideas, please feel free to send us an email at amionmute@gmail.com. We love hearing from you guys. And thank you to everyone who has sent us notes and suggestions in the past. We really appreciate it.